He tore her ultrasound into pieces and walked away. 3 years later, he saw her again, sitting at the next table, with 3 little girls who had his eyes. Alexander Hale sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the afternoon light filtering through the tall glass windows of his office and painting the room in shades of amber. He wore a light brown tailored suit, the kind that spoke of power and perfection, and his sharp brown eyes reflected both exhaustion and impatience. Emily stood before him, her hands trembling, a folded piece of paper clutched tightly in her grip. Her dark hair framed her pale face, and her blue eyes shimmered with a mixture of hope and fear. She had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head, telling herself that maybe, just maybe, he would understand. Slowly, she extended the paper toward him, the ultrasound printout that had carried her through sleepless nights. For a brief second, Alexander's gaze softened as he looked at the image, the faint outline of a tiny life taking form. But the softness vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hardness that Emily had come to recognize all too well in him. Without a word, he reached out, took the paper between his hands, and in one swift motion tore it down the middle. The sound of the ripping seemed louder than anything else in the world at that moment, echoing in her ears like a cruel reminder of reality. He let the pieces fall onto his desk, fragments of what could have been, and leaned back in his chair with a cold, practiced expression. "I'm not ready for this," he said, his voice measured, almost detached. "I can't deal with something like this now. Forget about it." Emily felt her knees weaken, as if the floor beneath her had shifted. Her chest tightened, and tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She searched his face for even the smallest sign of regret, some flicker of the man she had once believed capable of love. Instead, all she saw was distance, a wall she could never climb. The weight of his rejection pressed down on her, suffocating and merciless. She wanted to scream, to ask him how he could be so heartless, to demand that he see what she saw in that tiny blurred image. But no words came out. Her throat burned, and her hands, now empty, felt unbearably cold. She turned away, her steps unsteady, each one heavier than the last as she moved toward the door. Behind her, Alexander remained motionless, his eyes fixed not on her but on the city skyline, as though the world outside his window mattered more than the life he had just denied. When Emily finally stepped out of the office, the door closing quietly behind her, she knew something inside her had broken. The ultrasound was gone, torn into meaningless scraps, but the truth it carried still lived within her. In that moment, she understood that she was alone, completely and irreversibly alone, and that her life had just changed forever. The small apartment smelled faintly of damp walls and old wood, a far cry from the gleaming glass office she had left behind. Emily sat on the edge of her narrow bed, clutching her stomach as if she could shield the fragile lives inside her from the storm outside. The city lights flickered through the thin curtains, and the hum of passing cars reminded her that the world kept moving, indifferent to her pain. She had walked away from Alexander's office with nothing but the shattered pieces of hope, and now she was faced with the silence of solitude. The reality of what lay ahead pressed against her chest, heavier with each passing day. The doctors had not been kind with their warnings. The pregnancy was high risk, they said, and when the words triplets left the doctor's mouth, Emily had felt her world tilt. 3 children. Not 1, not 2, but 3 tiny lives depending solely on her. The enormity of it left her trembling, caught between terror and wonder. At night she lay awake, her body aching, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. How would she work? How would she feed them? Would she even survive the birth? Every uncertainty cut into her like a knife, but beneath it all pulsed a fierce, unyielding determination. Her family was far away, distant not only in miles but in heart. She had chosen a path that estranged her from them years ago, and she knew she could not run back now, begging for support. Friends, too, were scarce, scattered across the city with lives of their own, not equipped to shoulder the weight of her secret. She bore it alone, rising each morning with swollen eyes and dragging herself through the day, clinging to the thought that she was fighting for something greater than herself. The loneliness was sharp, almost physical, a constant companion that whispered in the quiet corners of her mind that she had been abandoned. But then she would place her hand over her stomach and feel the faint fluttering, the fragile reminder that she was not entirely alone. They were there, growing, waiting, fragile yet resilient. The sound of 3 heartbeats on the monitor during her last appointment had stayed with her, filling her ears long after the doctor left the room. It was both a burden and a blessing, a sign that despite the odds, life insisted on pushing forward. She found herself whispering promises in the stillness of the night, telling them that she would never give up on them, that she would give everything she had to bring them safely into the world. Her body grew weaker as the months passed, the weight of 3 children testing her limits in ways she had never imagined. Her ankles swelled, her back throbbed, and there were nights when the pain made her curl up and cry into the thin pillow, muffling her sobs so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Yet even in her darkest moments, when fear clawed at her and the shadow of despair stretched long across the walls, there was a spark that refused to die. The ultrasound image might have been torn to pieces by Alexander, but inside her, those tiny lives were whole, untouched by his rejection. She carried them with pride and with an aching kind of love, a love that grew stronger each day she survived the loneliness. The apartment might have been cold, her meals meager, her bank account nearly empty, but her will was unbroken. She would not let Alexander's decision define her children's future. She would stand in the storm, battered but unyielding, because what grew inside her was worth every sacrifice. The night was long and heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes echoing through the sterile hospital corridors. Emily lay on the delivery bed, drenched in sweat, her dark hair clinging to her temples as waves of pain tore through her body with merciless rhythm. She had known this day would be brutal, that bringing 3 children into the world would test every limit she had, but knowing it and living it were 2 entirely different things. Every contraction felt like fire ripping her apart, yet she clung to the thought that with each cry that would follow, her battle would bring forth life. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the sheet as another contraction raged, and she cried out, her voice hoarse, her strength fading yet unwilling to surrender. Doctors and nurses rushed around her, their voices a mixture of urgency and encouragement. "Stay with us, Emily, you can do this," one of them said, while another adjusted the monitors that tracked not 1 but 3 heartbeats. The sound of those tiny pulses filled the room, steady and insistent, reminding her why she could not give up. When the first child finally came, the cry pierced through the air, raw and fragile, and Emily's vision blurred with tears. Her heart swelled painfully as she caught a glimpse of a tiny face, red and wrinkled, with wisps of brown hair glistening under the harsh hospital light. Before she could even process it, the next wave of pain consumed her, dragging her deeper into the storm. The second baby followed, and then the third, each arrival accompanied by cries that rang out like a chorus, overlapping and weaving together into a sound so pure and overwhelming that Emily could hardly breathe. The exhaustion was immense, her body trembled violently, her chest heaved with shallow breaths, and she felt as though she might shatter into pieces. But amidst the chaos, she was overcome by awe. She had done it. Against the odds, against the loneliness, against the weight of rejection and fear, she had brought 3 new lives into the world. The nurses worked quickly, wrapping the newborns in soft blankets, and one by one, they were brought to her side. When the first bundle was placed in her arms, Emily's heart seemed to stop. The baby's tiny fingers curled instinctively, gripping her skin as if to say, "I am here." Her tears spilled freely now, rolling down her cheeks as she whispered their names in a shaky voice. Sophie, Lily, Chloe. Each name carried a piece of her heart, each child a miracle that had been denied by one man but embraced entirely by her. She gazed at them, stunned by how much they already resembled Alexander, with their dark lashes and the faintest hint of his brown eyes. It was like looking at pieces of him, reminders of the past she wanted to forget, yet they were hers, entirely hers, and in that moment she felt no bitterness, only an overwhelming surge of love. Her exhaustion was crushing, but the weight of 3 warm, fragile lives against her chest filled her with strength she had thought long gone. The pain and fear melted away, replaced by an almost holy stillness. She pressed her lips to each tiny forehead, inhaling the faint scent of newborn skin, and promised them silently that no matter how hard life became, they would never know abandonment, not from her. Her body was weak, her mind frayed, but her heart burned fiercely, tethered now to 3 little souls who depended on her completely. The room around her faded into insignificance. The machines, the sterile walls, the rushing nurses, all of it blurred into the background as Emily sat cradling her daughters, tears of joy mingling with tears of exhaustion. She had never felt so utterly broken and yet so profoundly whole. In one night, the loneliness of years was replaced with a fragile but powerful sense of belonging. She was no longer just Emily, the woman who had been left behind. She was a mother, and not just to one, but to 3 little miracles who had chosen to fight their way into the world alongside her. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights, endless responsibilities, and a love so fierce it sometimes frightened Emily. Her small apartment became both battlefield and sanctuary, its cramped rooms filled with the cries, laughter, and chaos of 3 growing girls. Every morning began before sunrise with the sound of Sophie calling out, her little voice waking her sisters, and soon all 3 were clamoring for attention, food, and comfort. Emily, exhausted and running on fragments of rest, would gather them close, preparing bottles, spooning out oatmeal, changing diapers, and soothing quarrels before she even had time to glance at the clock. The weight of raising them alone pressed against her chest daily, but the sight of their wide eyes and innocent smiles gave her the strength to push forward, even when her body screamed for relief. Work became an unrelenting struggle. She took on 2 jobs, cleaning offices in the early mornings and working late shifts at a diner, to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Her feet ached constantly, her back never seemed to loosen from the strain, and sometimes she would return home so tired she could barely lift the girls into bed. Yet when Sophie, Lily, and Chloe curled against her at night, their small arms wrapping around her as if she were their entire world, the fatigue dissolved into something bearable. She whispered stories to them in the dark, tales of princesses who survived impossible trials, never confessing that these stories were really her own hopes for them disguised as fairy tales. The girls grew quickly, identical in appearance yet already revealing different shades of personality. Sophie was the bold one, always the first to try new things and to test her mother's patience with daring curiosity. Lily was gentler, prone to quiet observation and sudden bursts of affection, the child who would climb into Emily's lap unprompted just to rest her head against her chest. Chloe, the youngest by minutes, seemed to carry the weight of her sister's energy, mischievous and endlessly giggling, turning even the most difficult moments into unexpected joy. Together they filled every corner of the apartment with life, their voices echoing off the peeling wallpaper and thin walls until the neighbors often complained. Emily would apologize with weary smiles, but inside she cherished the noise, for it reminded her daily that she was not alone anymore. There were nights, however, when loneliness crept back in with suffocating intensity. After the girls had finally fallen asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table, staring at bills she barely had the money to pay, wondering how long she could keep everything from collapsing. Her hands shook as she scribbled numbers, calculating and recalculating until the ink smeared on the page, but no matter how grim the math looked, she refused to let despair win. She thought of Alexander sometimes, of the man who had denied them, and for a fleeting moment anger would rise in her chest. But looking at her daughters sleeping peacefully in their shared bed, their identical faces serene and trusting, that anger melted away. They were worth every sacrifice, and she swore again and again that she would protect them from ever feeling unwanted. As the third year approached, Emily realized just how much they had all grown together. The girls could walk, talk, laugh, and sing, their personalities blooming like wildflowers despite the cracks in the pavement of their lives. Her body bore the marks of exhaustion, her eyes ringed with shadows that never seemed to fade, but her spirit was stronger than it had ever been. Each milestone, first steps, first words, the first time all three called her "Mommy" in unison, was etched into her memory like treasures she clung to during the darkest days. She lived on the edge of survival, yet within that struggle, she discovered a love so consuming that even the memory of rejection could not dim its brightness. Emily's life was hard, brutally so, but she had created a home where love outweighed scarcity, where laughter rose above worry, and where three little girls thrived against the odds. Her existence was no longer her own, it belonged to Sophie, Lily, and Chloe. And though her body ached and her spirit was tested daily, she would not trade a single hardship, for those three pairs of brown eyes had become the very reason she continued to breathe. The little restaurant was warm and noisy, filled with the hum of voices, the clinking of cutlery, and the sweet smell of baked bread. Emily sat at a corner table with her daughters, their small hands sticky with ice cream as they laughed and argued about who had the biggest scoop. Sophie leaned forward, her brown eyes wide with determination as she insisted she deserved another spoonful, while Chloe reached across the table to steal from her sister's bowl, giggling so hard she nearly toppled her chair. Lily, ever the peacemaker, tried to distract them by pointing out the colorful lights strung across the ceiling. Their laughter rang out above the chatter of the restaurant, drawing fond smiles from nearby diners. Emily watched them with a tired but proud smile, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face as she helped them wipe sticky fingers and guided the spoons back into bowls before too much spilled onto the table. For a moment, she let herself forget the constant weight of responsibility and simply savored the sound of her daughter's joy. Then she felt it, a prickling awareness that someone was watching. At first she ignored it, assuming it was just the natural curiosity people often showed when they realized the three girls were identical. But when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Across the room, at a table not far from theirs, sat Alexander Hale. He was dressed impeccably as always, in another light brown suit that clung to his broad shoulders, his hair neatly styled, his presence commanding even in a casual setting. He looked older, sharper, but in his expression there was something new, something fragile that flickered when his gaze fell upon her table. Emily froze, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She wanted to turn away, to pretend she had not seen him, but his eyes had already locked onto hers, and the years between them vanished in an instant. Alexander's gaze shifted from her face to the three little girls beside her, and Emily saw the exact moment when the truth struck him. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, and yet there was no denying what he saw. Sophie, Lily, and Chloe turned toward him with curious stares, their brown eyes, his brown eyes, gleaming beneath the restaurant's lights. The resemblance was undeniable. Emily's breath shook as she looked at her daughters and then back at the man who had once torn apart the very proof of their existence. He looked as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him, the polished veneer of the powerful CEO cracking as recognition seeped into his features. Emily's chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Anger flared within her, memories of that office, of the ultrasound ripped in two, of the words "forget about it" echoing in her ears. But alongside the anger was fear, fear of what this encounter could mean for her daughters, fear that the life she had so carefully built might unravel with a single conversation. She placed her hand protectively on Lily's shoulder, instinctively drawing the girls closer as though to shield them from his gaze. The noise of the restaurant seemed to dim, the laughter and chatter fading into the background until all that remained was the unbearable silence between her and Alexander. For a long moment, neither moved. Alexander sat frozen, his hand hovering uselessly above his glass of wine, while Emily stared back with defiance and uncertainty. Then, as if compelled by something greater than himself, he stood. His chair scraped against the floor, earning a brief glance from nearby diners, and he walked slowly toward her table. Emily's pulse quickened with every step he took, her thoughts spinning, torn between the urge to stand and flee and the determination to hold her ground. Sophie tugged at her sleeve, whispering questions about the stranger approaching them, but Emily could not answer. All she could do was watch as the man who had abandoned them drew closer, his face a mixture of disbelief, regret, and something she could not yet name. When he reached their table, Alexander's voice was low, strained, and unsteady, so different from the cold finality she remembered. "Emily," he said, his eyes flickering between her and the children, "are they?" He could not even finish the sentence, the weight of the truth choking his words. Emily's throat tightened as she looked at him, then at her daughters, who stared at the tall man with innocent curiosity. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her heart quaked inside her chest. "Yes. They are your daughters." The words fell like stones into the silence, leaving Alexander pale and shaken, his polished composure unraveling before her eyes. In that moment, Emily realized that the past she had tried so hard to bury had just risen again, alive and unavoidable, and the safe little world she had built for her daughters was about to change forever. Alexander stood frozen by the table, his breath shallow, his eyes darting from one child to the next as if he needed to see each face separately to believe what Emily had just said. Sophie tilted her head, studying him with an innocent curiosity, while Lily gripped her mother's arm a little tighter, sensing the tension, and Chloe gave a nervous giggle as if trying to break the strange silence. The truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable and irretrievable, and the sound of it seemed to reverberate through the small restaurant. Emily's voice lingered in his ears, the words, "your daughters," cutting deeper than any rejection or business failure he had ever faced. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply stared, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, the confident poise of the powerful executive stripped away in an instant. Emily's chest rose and fell as she tried to steady herself, but inside she was shaking. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her mind, often in the quiet hours of the night when the girls were asleep and the weight of loneliness pressed hardest against her. In some versions she cursed him, in others she ignored him, and sometimes she allowed herself to imagine him weeping with regret. Yet standing here now, face to face with the man who had abandoned them, all she felt was a complex swirl of emotions too heavy to untangle. Anger burned deep within her, anger for the nights she had spent crying alone, for the fear she had carried through a high-risk pregnancy, for every sacrifice she had made without help. But alongside that anger was an ache, an old wound torn open again, and beneath it all a strange, fragile sense of vindication. He could no longer deny them. The evidence was alive, breathing, laughing, and staring back at him with his own brown eyes. Alexander finally found his voice, though it was broken and unsteady. "They look just like me," he whispered, almost to himself, as if he still needed to say it aloud to believe it. He reached out a trembling hand but stopped midway, uncertain, his fingers curling into a fist. "I didn't know. I didn't," he cut himself off, his throat closing with the weight of the truth he had avoided for so long. Emily's gaze hardened, and she shook her head slowly. "You did know," she said quietly, her words sharper than any accusation shouted in anger. "I showed you, and you tore it apart. You told me to forget, and I had no choice but to carry it all alone." Her voice cracked slightly, but she held her chin high, refusing to let him see the tears that threatened to rise. The girls exchanged glances, too young to understand the history unfolding between their mother and the stranger standing before them, yet old enough to sense its importance. Sophie asked, "Mommy, who is he?" and Emily's heart clenched at the question. She looked down at their innocent faces, at the trust in their eyes, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's someone from a long time ago," she answered softly, her words deliberately vague, though the truth loomed heavy in the air. Alexander flinched at the distance in her tone, the way she spoke as if he were nothing more than a ghost from the past. For 3 years, he had lived in his empire of wealth and power, believing himself untouchable, but now he felt stripped bare by 3 small children and the woman who had survived without him. The weight of shame pressed down on him until his shoulders sagged, and he found himself struggling to breathe. "Emily," he said again, her name escaping his lips like a plea, "I made a mistake, the worst mistake of my life. Please, let me explain, let me." She cut him off with a raised hand, her blue eyes flashing. "Explain what?" "That you were too proud, too afraid, too selfish to face reality. There is nothing you can say that can erase the nights I sat awake wondering if they would survive, or the mornings I went to work with no sleep because I had no one else to lean on. You weren't there, Alexander. I was." Her voice trembled but grew stronger with every word, and for the first time he saw the depth of her strength, a strength born of years of struggle and sacrifice. Around them the restaurant carried on as if nothing had changed. Plates clattered, conversations hummed, and laughter drifted from other tables, but at theirs the world seemed suspended in silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. Alexander stood rooted, staring at the children who bore his features and the woman he had once turned away. Emily, her hand still resting protectively on Lily's shoulder, refused to yield, her presence unshakable despite the storm raging in her heart. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but for the first time in his life he understood that not everything could be bought, controlled, or demanded. The truth was here, alive and undeniable, and it demanded something of him that money and power could never provide. That night Alexander lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as the city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, mocking him with their glow. For years he had built his empire brick by brick, deal after deal, believing that success and wealth would shield him from regret, that power would silence any doubts about the choices he had made. But Emily's words echoed in his mind with a force he could not escape. He saw again the image of 3 little girls, their brown eyes reflecting his own, their laughter sharp as a knife because it revealed everything he had missed. The sound haunted him, and for the first time in years he felt powerless, stripped of the illusion that his life was whole. He pressed his hands to his face, but the weight of shame pressed harder, and no glass of whiskey, no distraction, could drown it out. He thought back to that day in his office, the moment when Emily had stood before him with trembling hands and he had torn apart the only proof of life she had been brave enough to share. The memory burned now with searing clarity, and he could not believe how cold he had been. At the time he had told himself he was protecting his career, protecting his carefully constructed life, convincing himself that fatherhood would only ruin everything he had worked for. Now those justifications sounded hollow, pathetic even, compared to the reality of what he had lost. He had abandoned not just Emily but 3 daughters who could have known him from the start, who could have reached for his hand, who could have grown up with his laughter instead of his absence. The thought clawed at his chest until he could hardly breathe. By morning his reflection in the mirror looked foreign to him. The carefully groomed hair, the expensive suit, the flawless mask of confidence felt meaningless, almost ridiculous. Beneath the surface was a man hollowed out by guilt, a man who had achieved everything society told him mattered and yet found himself stripped of the only thing that truly did. He made his way to Emily's small apartment, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. The building was modest, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers where he lived, and he hesitated at the door, almost turning back. But then he remembered the way Sophie had tilted her head at him, curious and unafraid, and the way Emily's voice had trembled with both strength and pain. He knocked, uncertain if she would even let him speak. Emily opened the door with wary eyes, her dark hair pulled back loosely, fatigue etched into her features. She looked at him not with surprise but with resignation, as though she had known he would come but had no faith in what he might say. The girl's laughter echoed faintly from inside, a sharp reminder of what he had missed, and Alexander felt his throat tighten. "Please, let me talk," he said softly, his voice stripped of the authority it once carried. Emily crossed her arms, her posture rigid, her blue eyes sharp. "Talk? After 3 years of silence? After I begged you to see me, to see them? Where were you when I was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table? Where were you when they were sick, when they cried through the night, when I thought I might not survive another day? You don't get to just show up now and act like words will fix everything." Her anger was quiet but devastating, each sentence striking harder than the last. Alexander lowered his gaze, his chest heavy with shame. He wanted to explain that he had been afraid, that he had convinced himself he was incapable of being a father, that he had buried his conscience beneath layers of success. But as he looked at her, standing so fiercely despite the exhaustion she carried, he realized excuses were meaningless. He dropped to his knees, a man unrecognizable from the proud executive who had once dismissed her, and his voice cracked as he said, "I was wrong. I don't deserve forgiveness, I don't deserve you or them, but I want to try. Let me be near them, let me make even the smallest amends. Please, Emily, I can't undo the past, but I will spend the rest of my life trying if you let me." Emily's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him kneeling, his polished exterior shattered. For a long moment she said nothing, torn between the fury that had kept her going for 3 years and the faint, dangerous flicker of hope she had buried deep within herself. Behind her, the sound of Sophie, Lily, and Chloe playing drifted into the room, their voices bright and unbroken, and she glanced toward them with the kind of love that had carried her through every hardship. When she looked back at Alexander, her expression was hard, her voice steady. "You will never know the weight of what you put us through," she said, "and nothing you do will erase it. If you want to prove you're more than the man who walked away, then show me. Show them. Don't just say the words. Live them." Alexander nodded, his chest tightening with both relief and fear. He understood now that this was no simple plea for forgiveness but a test of his soul, a trial that would demand more of him than any business deal ever had. He rose slowly, humbled, carrying the heavy knowledge that redemption would not come quickly, if it came at all. Yet in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt a fragile sense of purpose ignite within him. He had 3 daughters and a woman who had survived his absence, and though he did not yet deserve them, he would fight with everything he had to earn his place in their lives. The months that followed were unlike anything Alexander had ever known. The man who once measured his worth in contracts and quarterly reports now measured his days in small victories, the way Sophie's laughter shifted from cautious to free when he picked her up from the park, the way Lily's shy glances softened into trust as she reached for his hand, and the way Chloe would climb onto his lap uninvited, tugging at his tie until he abandoned his phone to give her his full attention. At first, the girls were hesitant, curious but distant, their young hearts unsure of who this stranger was. Yet children have a way of sensing truth, and they saw quickly that he was trying. He stumbled often, burned breakfast more times than he cared to admit, and made clumsy attempts at braiding hair that ended in tangles, but he showed up every single day, and in time his persistence became its own kind of love. Emily watched this transformation with a guarded heart. She had spent years convincing herself that she did not need him, that he was nothing but a painful memory, and now here he was in her kitchen, kneeling on the floor to help Chloe build towers out of mismatched blocks while Sophie corrected him on how to stack them. There were nights when she lay awake wondering if she was a fool to let him back into their lives, haunted by the memory of torn paper and broken promises. Yet when she heard the girls' delighted squeals as he spun them around the living room, or when she saw him stumble home from his office only to sit cross-legged on the floor and read bedtime stories until his voice grew hoarse, she felt her walls weaken. His remorse was not in his words but in his actions, repeated again and again until they began to feel less like penance and more like devotion. It was not an easy road. There were arguments, old wounds reopened without warning, moments when Emily's anger surfaced with raw intensity. She demanded answers for nights he could never give back, for years of silence, and Alexander faced each confrontation without defense, accepting her fury as his burden to carry. He did not beg for shortcuts to forgiveness. Instead, he let the weight of his mistakes hang heavy on him, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges between them began to soften, carved down by time, patience, and the simple rhythm of shared life. One evening, months after that first encounter in the restaurant, Emily stood in the doorway of the girls' bedroom, watching as Alexander tucked them in. Sophie insisted on one more story, Lily whispered a secret in his ear that made him smile, and Chloe refused to sleep unless she held his hand. He stayed there long after their eyelids grew heavy, his tall frame hunched over the tiny bed, his expression tender in a way Emily had never seen before. Something inside her shifted as she watched him, not with the reckless hope of the girl she had once been, but with the cautious faith of a woman who had endured and survived. For the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe people could change, that maybe even the deepest wounds could heal. Later that night, when the apartment was quiet and the city hummed softly beyond the windows, Emily sat at the kitchen table while Alexander cleared the dishes without being asked. He moved with a kind of reverence, as though even the smallest tasks mattered, and when he finally sat across from her, the silence between them was not heavy but alive with something unspoken. She looked at him for a long time, seeing both the man who had hurt her and the man who was learning, day by day, to make amends. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, when she finally spoke. "I forgive you." The words hung in the air, trembling with both pain and relief, and Alexander froze, his eyes filling with tears he did not try to hide. He reached across the table, and when her hand met his, it was not the beginning of a fairy tale but the fragile start of something real. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and shadows of the past, but Emily no longer carried the burden alone. Their daughters, three bright and beautiful reflections of both their flaws and their hope, bound them together in a way nothing else could. For the first time in years, Emily felt her heart unclench, and Alexander felt the weight of redemption settling into his bones. The story of their lives had been scarred by abandonment and pain, but as they sat together in that small apartment with the sound of their daughters breathing in the next room, they knew that their ending, though imperfect, had finally found its light.